let's start with increases. So if the number of students went up, how can we express this? Well, it's very easy. You could use verbs, and I'm going to present all of these verbs in the past tense, assuming that the data has been collected. And remember, the past tense is the tense that you will be using mostly in your writing. So you could say the number of students grew. You could say the number of students increased. The number of students rose. The number of students climbed, went up, or even rocketed. Right? So you see, we've already determined what the subject is. So the subject has been identified here. We'll highlight it in green. And then following this, we're going to mention our verb. So in this case, I'm going to say the number of students grew. Okay? So as you can see, my verb, I'm going to highlight the verb phrase in this color. But remember, sometimes it's more than one word. So for example, went up. That's why we refer to it as a verb phrase. So instead of saying the number of students grew, you could say the number of students went up, right? Okay, but what if we're describing a decrease? Well, you could use verbs such as fell, decreased, declined, dropped, and if it's especially hard, you could refer to it as plummeted. So remember, rocketed means to increase very quickly and to a great amount, right? But then the opposite would be plummeted, which means to fall very suddenly and to fall to a very considerable degree. Okay? But which leaves me with fluctuations. How could we mention fluctuations? Well, there's a verb, fluctuated. So you could say the number of students fluctuated. I'm going to write a few more examples here for you to see. So here's the second one, and this time we're going to describe a decrease. So I'm going to go with went down or decreased. And what about fluctuation? Once again, I'll show you. So you could say the number of students fluctuated, right? Same structure, nothing really fancy here. Now, another way you could describe changes is by describing what we call proportional changes. So let's say I have witnessed an increase from 20% to 40%. So it's twice the amount, isn't it? What verbs could we possibly use to describe this? Well, you could say it doubled. So when something goes from 20% to 40%, it has doubled. If it goes from 30% to 90%, then it's tripled. If it goes down from 50% to 25%, it has halved. And you could also use, for example, a structure like decrease to, and then you need some kind of fraction here. And by fraction, I mean a third, maybe a quarter, or a fifth. Right? Just a few common examples. So you could say it decreased to a third. So if it was 90%, it decreased to 30%. It decreased to a third. It decreased to a quarter. If it was like 100, it went down to 25. Or a fifth, right? So you get the idea. These structures can be used to describe, as I mentioned, proportional changes. So let's try to add one more example up here to describe these proportional changes. So how can we do that? Well, you could say the number of students, I'm just going to go with the first one, doubled, right? So we have all of our verbs very neatly classified here and broken down into categories based on what kind of change they are describing. Okay. So what about adverbs? Well, one thing you need to know is that when you're describing these changes, when you say grow, it just shows that it went up. It doesn't show me whether it went up quickly or whether it went up slowly, whether it went up only a small amount or whether it increased very considerably. So as you can see, as I'm describing these changes, I'm using certain kinds of adverbs, right? And so here we need some kinds of adverbs to describe the extent or the speed of change that we are observing. So for example, if you want to describe an increase that happened very quickly, well, you can use adverbs such as quickly, swiftly, suddenly, rapidly, and sharply. But sometimes you want to describe an increase that didn't happen very suddenly over a short period of time, but rather it happened to a very great extent. It increased a lot, right? So it went from 5% to something like 80%. So relative to everything else we're seeing in the chart, this increase was greater. So how do we emphasize the great amount in the change, right? Not necessarily happening very quickly. It might have happened over thousands or hundreds of years, but what is important is that the increase was great in amount. How can we do that? What kind of adverbs can we use? Well, you could use adverbs like dramatically, significantly, or considerably. Right? So I hope you now understand the difference between saying something increased quickly versus saying something increased dramatically. All right? In both cases, we have an increase. In one, we're emphasizing the speed and how quickly the increase took place. And in another one, we're emphasizing how great a change has occurred over time. But what about the opposite? What if we want to describe how the change has occurred, but we're not emphasizing how quickly or how great the change has been, but rather we want to emphasize how the change has happened very slowly. All right, so as you can see, the first adverb we could use is slowly. But what else? We could also use gradually or gently. Or if we want to talk about an increase or a decrease that happened in a very small amount, right? It was very insignificant. What could we say? Well, we could say it increased slightly or it increased minimally. All right? These are the adverbs that you could use. There's one more adverb that I want to introduce to you, and that is whenever you're describing an increase or a decrease that wasn't very smooth and steady, but rather the change that occurred was kind of bumpy. So we had an increase, but instead of an increase like this, we have an increase that goes like this, up and down, but the overall trajectory is rising. Or the opposite, you have it going up and down, but the trend is downward. So what kind of adverb could we use there? Well, you could use a modifier like accompanied by fluctuation. How do we use this? I'll show you. So you could say something like the number of students increased accompanied by fluctuation, right? So it means it wasn't a smooth and steady rise, but rather it was a bumpy one. So there were a lot of ups and downs associated, right? So we've also seen the adverbs that you could use with these verbs. And so I want you to bear in mind that these adverbs are not the same as the adverbs that describe time and quantity. These structures, these are different. These are used to form a more accurate verb phrase, right? So they're part of the verb phrase, and so I'm still going to highlight these in red. Okay, so we've also looked at the adverbs that we could use. Okay, so let's add these adverbs, okay? In the first example, I'm going to say the number of students went up dramatically. So it means the change in number was great. Or we could say it decreased slowly, or it fluctuated slightly. No, try not to use adverbs with fluctuated. If it's fluctuated, don't say fluctuated slowly or fluctuated rapidly. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Keep it simple. Also true for doubled. You don't double dramatically. It doubles, right? So no additional adverbs for fluctuation and then proportional changes. Okay, now that we've mentioned the number of students went up dramatically, we also want to add our adverbs, the time period and the amount. Rule number 1, try to mention the amount, the quantity first. The rule is it's easier for your sentences to be understood if the adverb is placed close to the verb. Okay, so adverbs describing quantity should be closer to the verb. Here we could say the number of students went up dramatically by 75%. Notice by is the one we use to describe the difference, right? So maybe it went up from 1% to 76%. So how much did it increase? It increased by 75%. And then I also want to mention the time period. So I'm going to say from January to March. Okay, now here's another one. The number of students decreased slowly. This time, I'm going to mention how much this decreased by mentioning the start and the end point. So instead, I'm going to say from, and let's say 5% to 80%. So it increased by 75%, right? So from 5% to 80%. But it's not great if I say from January to March again. The reason is I have from to, and then I also have from to mentioned one more time, which isn't great. It's a little redundant and repetitive. So what can I do instead? Well, instead of saying from January to March, I can say between January and March. Okay, so there. If you want to create even more change in your writing, here's what you could do. So this time, consider placing the adverb of time between January and March, or maybe from January to March at the beginning of your sentence. Let me show you what I mean. So here, my sentence is going to be from January to March, the number of students fluctuated. You see, I have stated the adverb of time at the very beginning. And you could do this for any of these sentences. So here, for example, you could say the number of students went up dramatically by 75% from January to March, or you could say from January to March, the number of students went up dramatically by 75%. So you see, here's a little tip that I want to share with you. Adverbs can move, right? Especially adverbs of time can be placed either at the end or at the very beginning of your sentence. Another thing about adverbs is even in your verb phrase, you can switch your adverb position. So for example, here I can say the number of students went up dramatically by 75%, or I could say the number of students dramatically went up by 75%. So you can see it's went up dramatically went up. They are both correct. So both structures can be used. Or in this case, I could have said the number of students slowly decreased instead of decreased slowly. Which one's better? No difference. They're both the same. They're both correct. But remember, what's important is that by creating these variations, you are producing sentences that are different in structure, and so the examiner will appreciate this variety in your sentence structures and the way you're expressing your ideas. Okay, so what else can we change? Well, adverbs of time, we saw, we can move them around. And so we can create differences here. Let's add adverb of time to the third sentence. Let's see how we can do that. See, it says, from January to March, the number of students fluctuated. But how do we describe fluctuation? Because fluctuation is essentially a variable that starts at a point, goes up and down, up and down, up and down, and then reaches about the same amount. If it goes up, that's an increase accompanied by fluctuation. If it goes down, that's a decrease accompanied by fluctuation. We are describing a fluctuation that happens around a central point. And so what you're going to do is you're going to use the preposition around, right? So it fluctuated around 20%, for example. And so I'm going to highlight this in the same color that we've used to describe adverbs. So bear in mind that the adverb, the preposition we use to describe the adverb of quantity is around for the verb fluctuation. All right, now let's do this one. The number of students doubled. Okay. Am I going to mention from what point to another? Not necessarily, especially if your sentences are linked together. So later, I'm going to show you how to write a response by combining these sentences together. And sometimes when you combine sentences together, you get to create additional variety. So let's say the previous sentence we said that the number of students reached 20%. Okay, so before we read this sentence, the one highlighted here, we know that it reached 20%. And then we say, following this, the number of students doubled. It's obvious. If it was 20% and it doubled, it means it went up from 20% to 40%. So do I need to say the number of students doubled to 40%? Probably not, because it's understandable from the context, from what came before it. So no need for you to mention the numbers all the time, right? But you want to mention the time. So we're going to say from, let's say, March to the end of April. So once again, we have from March to the end of April. We're going to highlight that in the same color that we used to highlight all of our adverbs, right? So as you can see, we have used the structures that we introduced, the first structure, the verb phrase structure, to write sentences describing increases, decreases, and also fluctuations. If you enjoyed this video, please do me a favor, like, subscribe, and share this link with other people who may find this content useful. And keep in mind that you can access complete video tutorials plus additional content by becoming a member of this channel. As always, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.